issue. Water is a big deal, and it's a key ingredient for the health and well-being of humans and non-human life. It's also essential for social and economic development. Water pretty much affects every part of all life on the planet. Some of the items listed here are obvious, such as personal health and agriculture, whereas other items might be a little less obvious. But water is a key player in the production of energy, important transportation routes for goods and services along rivers and canals, and plenty of recreational activities are tied to water. And of course, many manufacturing processes require water. So you might have discussed the use of water in your life cycle analysis because it's such a key part of life. Water is also critical for ecosystems, and it's required for the survival of all life on the planet, and including services that ecosystems provide for humanity. So ensuring that there's enough water and enough clean water is a big deal. A clear sign of the importance of water is the fact that the United Nations declared 2005 to 2015, the whole decade of that time, as the Water for Life decade. Humans need approximately 2 liters of water per day just to survive. Water makes up approximately 60% of the body of an adult, and it does not take a lot for one to become dehydrated if you don't get enough water, and if you get dehydrated, then your body won't function properly. Now, Canada is among the water richest country in the world, but we're also among the highest per capita users of water. The water infrastructure we have can provide between 400 to 500 liters per person per day for personal use, and we use about 250 of those liters. This does not even include industrial uses of water. Let's think about references of how much water this actually is. So the water in the SFU's 25-meter swimming pool would last a class of the size of REM 100, so approximately 170 students, for about 8 days. In comparison, the poorest countries in the world, where the water use is much less, the available water per person can be as low as 20 liters per day per person, compared to the high levels that we use in Canada. Now, when you look at the water supply, there are two components, quantity and quality. There obviously must be a sufficient supply of water, and the water needs to be clean. In this series of lectures, we will be looking at both quantity and quality. Here are the main objectives for this series of lectures on water. By the end of the series, you should have a good understanding of the global distribution of freshwater and how that freshwater is used. You should also be able to explain the concept of water scarcity, and you will see that there are different kinds of water scarcity. We will then move to freshwater and freshwater quality before we talk about the effects of climate change on water availability and also discuss different options for managing water resources. Let's begin with the very basics. The total amount of water on the planet is fixed. Now let's just pause for a moment and think about that. That means that all the water that there ever was and all the water there ever will be is fixed on the planet. There is no external source for water. Now, every now and then, a meteor might come towards the planet that's made of frozen water in the form of ice, obviously, but as you can appreciate, that's a minuscule amount of water relative to the planet. So it's key to remember that the water on Earth is fixed. The total amount on the planet is fixed. So, as we learned in one of the first lectures in REM 100, the hydrological cycle is a closed system that contains all of the water and then just continuously recycles it. The total amount of water that we have is approximately 1.39 billion cubic kilometers. Now, this is a huge amount of water, but not all of that water is available to us or useful to us. 97% of the world's water is in the oceans. Because that water is salty, it is not direct use to humans. There are ways to desalinate ocean water and turn it into fresh water, but doing so requires a lot of energy, and therefore this is not a feasible approach for large-scale water supplies. This means that only 3% of all the existing water on the planet is potentially useful to humans. Of the existing freshwater, only about two-thirds are locked in ice. These are primarily the big ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica, as well as in alpine glaciers. So another 30% or so, just under a third, is stored in groundwater. So groundwater is water that's stored in the porous sediments, as in all the porous, where all the spaces in the sediments, and this is where water can flow. Surface water, so obviously water on the surface of the Earth, is the water that's actually directly accessible to humans, and this makes up about 1/3 of a percent of the total freshwater amount. Almost 90% of this water is in lakes. The Great Lakes of Canada come to mind immediately, but the biggest freshwater lakes are Lake Baikal in Russia and Lake Tanganyika in East Africa. Lake Baikal alone contains almost a quarter of the world's surface freshwater. Another 11% of the surface freshwater is stored in marshes and swamps, and only 2% is in rivers. So, given that fresh water is 3% of the total available water, this means that the fresh water that is available to us on the surface is 1/3 of a percent of 3%, or 1/100th of a percent of the total existing water. This is a tiny amount of the total amount of water available on the planet, but it's still equal to 139,000 cubic kilometers. So that would be a cube of water that is 51 kilometers long, 51 kilometers wide, and 51 kilometers high. Of course, all of this water is not evenly distributed across the planet. This map shows the available replenishable supply of fresh water per person for each country, so it's a per capita map. The map comes from around 2000, year 2000, so it's a little over 20 years out of date, but it shows the general picture. The pattern you see here is a combination of the amount of water that is provided by nature every year and the population density to give it a per capita rating. So we find the lowest numbers in the sub-Saharan African areas and the Arabian Peninsula because there is very little water that is supplied here because of the lack of rainfall, essentially, and relatively limited underground aquifers. In other areas, like India or Bangladesh, there is relatively low per capita water availability because of the large populations. At the top of the list in terms of water per capita water supply is Iceland. Being a relatively small island in the North Atlantic, it gets many storms with lots of precipitation coming through, and obviously there are lots of glaciers there, and Iceland has a relatively small population. Therefore, the per capita water availability is quite high. Canada also looks pretty good in terms of per capita water availability because, again, of our ample supply and our relatively low population levels. Canada has about 20% of the world's total freshwater resources, which includes water that is locked in glaciers and the groundwater. But nevertheless, we also have about 7% of the world's renewable freshwater that is directly available for human use. Given that Canadians only make up about 0.5% of the global population, then the amount of water we have available in Canada is quite large. The only twist is that more than half of this water drains north into the Arctic Ocean and Hudson Bay. And since the majority of Canadians live along the southern border, that water draining south or draining north through Hudson Bay is not really accessible to the major population centers in Canada. But nevertheless, we still have plenty of water in terms of quantity in Canada. Let's shift gears and switch from how much water is available to how much water we actually use. Based on the numbers published in this 1999 paper, the extraction of fresh water for human use was about 4,400 cubic kilometers, and around 2,000 to 2,300 cubic kilometers were actually used by humans. At the time of this publication, about 57% of the world's fresh water withdrawal and 70% of the world's water consumption took place in Asia. And this is due to large populations and because the world's major irrigated lands are there to produce rice. On the numbers on the slide are a little bit outdated, but the general picture is valid. The numbers in an article in Nature in 2019 indicate that the current extraction of fresh water for human use is about 4,600 cubic kilometers, so there's not much difference from the numbers on this slide. Now, what is all this water used for? These maps show how water use for different sectors occurs as a percentage of the extracted water. There are some interesting patterns on these maps, but the main take-home message is that approximately 70% of the extracted water is used in agriculture, 20% is used in industrial processes, and only about 10% is used for everyday domestic activities. In other words, we turn the majority of extracted water, that's 70% of it, into food. The percentages of industrial use of water is also quite high in Canada, and one possible reason relates to things like the extraction of the oil sands and other petroleum products, because this requires a lot of water, because as you get to the end of the well, when you drill a well and you see the movies where the oil gushes up through the derrick, that occurs for a little bit, but then that doesn't last forever, and so water is pumped down into the well to force the rest of the oil up to the surface. What you see on this chart is how the global water use has evolved since 1900. Since that time, the extracted amount of water has increased from roughly 500 cubic kilometers to almost 44,500 cubic kilometers in 2010. So the extraction has increased by a factor of 9. During the same time, the world population has increased from 1.6 to 6.9 billion, a factor of 4.3. So this means water use has increased at roughly twice the rate of population growth. But despite the substantial increase, there is still plenty of water as we only have used a fraction of the available water. But the problem is that the available water is not distributed and used evenly across the world. This brings up the topic of water scarcity. Water scarcity is a local condition that occurs when the demand for water from all types of human use is higher than the available resources under the current institutional arrangement, which refers to the existing infrastructure and legal situation. It's necessary to realize that water scarcity is a relative concept that can occur at any level of supply and demand. So arid areas do not necessarily suffer from water scarcity if they manage to keep the demand for the available water lower than the natural supply. Today, approximately 700 million people, or about 10% of the world's population, live in areas that suffer from water scarcity. The United Nations currently estimates that this number will go up in the future, and water is becoming one of the most serious resource issues in the world. Now, water scarcity is partially a social construct because the demand for water is driven by affluence, expectations, and customary behavior. But in general, water researchers and managers talk about water scarcity when the water supply drops below 1,000 cubic meters per person per year. So that's cubic meters, not cubic kilometers. So there were orange countries in the global map that we showed earlier that talk about the available fresh water. So resource managers talk about water stress when the annual water supply drops below 1,700 cubic meters per person. When the climatological water supply is the limiting factor, experts talk about physical water scarcity. In this case, nature simply does not supply enough water for the local demand, and the areas shaded in medium blue on this map currently are experiencing physical water scarcity, and the light blue areas are approaching physical water scarcity. These are generally the arid areas in the world, where they also have substantial populations. Another type of water scarcity is economic water scarcity, where the existing infrastructure is the problem. In these areas, nature supplies enough water, but it cannot be captured in a way that makes it usable for people. These areas are shaded with dark blue, which include Central Africa and northern parts of India and some of Southeast Asia, as well as parts of Central and South America. Now, the shortfall between water supply and water demand is often made up of groundwater or fossil water. Groundwater is water that is stored in porous sediments near the surface, and it is continuously getting replenished, at least at some rate. Fossil water are the ancient bodies of water that have been deposited in geological structures and have remained disconnected from other water sources and undisturbed for thousands of years. The challenge with the use of these types of waters is that they replenish very slowly or not at all. But because they are commons, as in common goods, anybody who can afford to drill a well can access them and pump them out, and then there's very slow recharge. The water from these sources is often used for agriculture in areas that agriculture would not normally be suited. In addition, cheap energy prices make it even more affordable to exploit these water sources, and then that promotes even more unsustainable use. This typically leads to overuse of these types of water resources. If the rate of extraction exceeds the rate of recharge, the water level in the aquifer will drop, and eventually it will be sucked dry. Just a quick flashback to our discussion on market failures. The overexploitation of groundwater is a good example for open access issues and perverse subsidies. This map highlights regions where groundwater is currently being exploited in an unsustainable way. Areas in yellow and red are areas where the withdrawals of water are exceeding the natural supply. You can see a huge swath in North America, big areas in Pakistan and India, as well as in China and Australia. Another area of concern is South Africa, which has been struggling with water supplies in recent years. This brings us to the Cape Town water crisis of 2018. So as you know, Cape Town is a major urban center in South Africa with roughly 4.3 million residents. After years of drought, the government projected in January of 2018 that the city would run out of water by April 22nd, which became known as Day Zero. This triggered major water use restrictions and efforts to conserve water to avoid Day Zero. We don't have enough time here to go into the details of this event, but it is an amazing case study that illustrates how population growth, limited resources, bad planning, and extreme weather promoted by climate change can produce a perfect storm that leaves the population of the size of Cape Town absolutely without water. Cape Town could have been the first city that literally ran out of water. In the end, the city was able to avert the situation, but this is just a temporary aversion, and the threat is still there. If you want to know more about the Cape Town water crisis of 2018, there are some links on Canvas of 2 short PBS NewsHour videos. And then a general Google search will also bring up lots of information about the crisis and how it was managed. This brings us to the end of this first lecture on water, which focused on the quantity of available water and water use. We have learned that the Earth has a fixed amount of water, and it always has because it's a closed hydrological system. We've also learned that the accessible fresh water is only a tiny fraction of all the water available on the planet. But even though this is a tiny fraction, there is still enough fresh water globally to match human demand. However, the problem is that the available water is distributed unevenly, and it does not match the local demand in many areas. This results in local water scarcity. We distinguish between physical and economic water scarcity to highlight the causes behind that scarcity. And at the end, we talk about the unsustainable use of groundwater to make up the difference between supply and demand. In the next lecture, we will take a look at the issue of water quality. Thank you for listening to here, and that's all for now. We'll talk to you again next time.